Friends, I bring you greetings in the name of the Lutheran World Federation, the communion of 149 Lutheran churches around the globe in 7 regions from Geneva, Switzerland, where I'm joining you today. And as the program executive for theology in the area of theological education and formation in the LWF, I'm so grateful to Lutheran Education Australia for the chance to contribute to this LEA Ministry Conference. And I pray that you and yours are well, and while COVID has taken so much from us in this past year, we have received a certain gift of global solidarity by having the chance to meet together in these modes. So I'm grateful. And let me appreciate that LEA honors your identity as part of the global Lutheran family through the Lutheran Church in Australia. And let me take a moment to greet Bishop Henderson and all of our friends in the LCA. LEA's core propositions describes your highly effective teachers in Lutheran schools whose ethos is rooted in the distinctives of the Lutheran tradition. And I want to build on that basis for my 2-part keynote today that I'm calling Education Through a Lutheran Lens, Formation, Reformation, Transformation. In this first part, I begin by recalling the importance of education in Luther's Reformation and explore that link between formation, reformation, and transformation, and relate it to transformative pedagogy as an educational philosophy. And in the second part, I want to make that connection between transformative pedagogy and the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 on quality education, and how we see this around our Lutheran communion and relate it to our Lutheran commitment to formation, reformation, and transformation. So first, a story about education. What is education? If you were to describe the aim or the goal of education, what would it be? I want to share this image from Senegal in West Africa, where I taught for many years with my wife and children. This is my son, Paul Michael, here eating around this bowl with our friend and sister, Nene Gadjo, as we do in Senegal. And in Senegal, the oldest generation eats with the youngest generation. And those in the middle ages of adulthood eat together, thinking we're off solving the problems of the world. But it's the oldest and the youngest generation that eats together. This is an intergenerational moment to tell stories, to pass on wisdom. And in the Wolof language, this is called Nit Kujam, which means making people of peace. It's the Wolof concept of education, making, formation. And not just any kind of formation, but making people of peace who can transform society into a peaceable place. Now, of course, education is part transmission, because there are information that we don't know about math and sciences and history, but this story reminds us that education is also about formation and a kind of knowing that's embodied through experiences of relationships that transform us across genders, ages, cultures, languages. So education is part information, but part formation. And not just practical formation, for the sake of contributing to economic well-being of the home or the state. Education results in the formation of certain skills, and marketable ones, to be sure, but education should never be a means to an economic end. Rather, education is about forming human beings to become Nit Kujam. So the heart of education is humanization, freeing people to be what we were created to be. And this is going to be a significant part of the pedagogical theory of Paulo Freire that I'll point to shortly. But this notion of education is also part of our Lutheran identity, and it was held by the Reformers and Martin Luther particularly. Remember that Luther's whole project was not only concerned with the reform of the church structures and doctrinal reform. The whole Lutheran Reformation was a critique of power structures that maintained unjust and oppressive systems, those systems that bound people's consciences, as well as their financial and political agency. And the whole Reformation project was about liberation, That liberty began with justification before God, but Christian liberty freed us and called us to engage in critical thinking about the world in which we live together. And so the Reformation extended beyond the boundaries of the church. Luther and the Reformers advocated for changing the fundamental abuses of power in the political and the civic sphere. And these reforms included the reform of public education in Saxony. Luther made various proposals about education, aimed mostly at higher education. But in his 1524 treatise to all the councilmen of all the cities in Germany that they establish and maintain Christian schools, Luther gave a strong defense of the need to strengthen primary education. And culturally, it seems that people at that time were denigrating the value of classical education because it was viewed as a mere preparation for the priesthood and did not lead to any kind of economic gain for the family. But Luther advocated for well-educated citizens who could constructively contribute to the life of the church and the cohesion of a peaceful society. And that idea is significant for today in an education that promotes social cohesion, and later we'll make that connection to SDG number 4. But in his 1530 sermon on keeping children in school, Luther was clear that the aim of education is not to develop skills that are useful for generating wealth, but rather to transform individuals so that they can contribute to the public welfare and peace through whatever discipline they feel called to live out their baptismal vocation to loving service. And I want to share this paragraph from his sermon as an encouragement to all children and students and educators and parents who know that liberal arts education, in which he includes music as an art and a theory related to math, is about nurturing diverse vocational capacities. So Luther writes, "At this point, I should also mention how many educated people are needed in the fields of medicine and all liberal arts. Where are the preachers, jurists, and physicians to come from if grammar and other rhetorical arts are not taught? For such teaching is the spring from which they all must flow. A diligent and upright schoolmaster or teacher or anyone who faithfully trains and teaches children can never be adequately rewarded or repaid with any amount of money. As even the heathen Aristotle says, I know that next to that of preaching, teaching is the best, greatest, and most useful office there is." So it's no surprise that Luther and Melanchthon were architects of a system of public education that included educating girls in public school, which is a jewel of our Lutheran heritage that we should lift up, which we do across the Lutheran World Federation today, promoting the education of girls and women through diaconal programs and theological education. And Luther saw this link between theological education and social transformation. He wrote that through education, God can transform a child like carving a prince from a block of wood. A Lutheran approach to education is about forming people who can fulfill their vocation to be caretakers, tillers, and keepers of God's earth, and contribute then to the physical, political, economic, and ecological health and well-being of their society. So for Lutherans, formation is a driver of reformation, because liberation leads to transformation. And the goal of education is to transform individuals who transform the world, as Paulo Freire once said. And that turns us now from the purpose of education to pedagogical questions of how education achieves that kind of liberation and transformation. And as educators, you all know very well that this requires in-depth interdisciplinary conversations with neuroscience about how we learn, with psychology about what motivates us to learn, and educational philosophy about how we teach. And I'm convinced that the educational philosophy that is suited to this kind of Lutheran perspective on formation and reformation and transformation, particularly for our post-colonial age, is transformative pedagogy. Now, Ominota Ukpokodu defines transformative pedagogy as combining the elements of constructivist and critical pedagogy that empowers students to examine critically their beliefs and knowledge with the goal of developing a reflective knowledge base, an appreciation for multiple perspectives, and a sense of critical consciousness and agency. So she names there constructivism and critical theory. So first, for thinking of constructivism, I point to Seymour Papert, who is a South African educator. His theory of constructionism understood learning to be reconstruction rather than mere transmission of knowledge. And he believed that the construction of knowledge was most effective when the learner constructs something meaningful or makes meaning in the constructive process. It's a learner-centered approach that focuses on the learning process. So the relationships in which formation occurs are just as important as the information. There are clear implications for learning here in the context of a community of faith, and in our context, a Lutheran context. And here I want to appreciate LEA's emphasis on culture as an important part of the ethos of learning in your Growing Deep initiative. So secondly, critical theory, and that points me to Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator that worked for the World Council of Churches in the 1970s. And he taught a method of empowerment rooted in critical theory. So for Freire, education is a process of liberating learners to be active agents. And education is a process of conscientization in Portuguese that resists a banking model of education that colonizes a student's mind by dislocating the learner from the context of their learning and deposits information which may or may not be meaningful to the student or have a positive impact on their vocational development. So in this model of education, it's a process of humanization. Humanization that liberates knowledge from above and epistemologically reconnects learners to the means of making knowledge. So transformative pedagogy helps learners to make meaning, learn in dialogue with the generative words and meaningful concepts of their culture, which include a faith tradition. And with that consciousness, reflect critically on the logic of the social, political, and ecological relationships in which we live in the world around us. And then with that critical eye, to begin to know how to reform or transform them to be more loving, just, or sustainable. So for Freire, education is never neutral. Education either domesticates people to the values and knowledge of some dominant culture, or it liberates people to become critical and creative agents in society. I imagine you already see there the link between transformative pedagogy and the Lutheran tradition. Luther translated the Bible and other foundational theological and catechetical and educational texts into vernacular German for the use in home and schools so that people could be in dialogue with the lived realities of local life, farming, trade, even health and social welfare policies. And the aim of Luther's project was not nationalism, but rather a humanization of the gospel and knowledge, incarnating that liberating word in our lives and realities in a way that forms and equips us with that capacity, both by God's grace and human reason, to live out our vocation, to love our neighbors, and reform unjust systems. As an educational philosophy, transformative pedagogy is rooted in this kind of humanism, where formation of the person is the goal. Not humanism in the sense of secularism, but making formation more focused on the person and embodied in their context of meaningful relationships. So just as the church provides relationships for us to form our baptismal vocation to love and serve, education is a process of formation that takes place in an embodied community of interdisciplinary, multicultural relationships and ecologies in which knowledge becomes meaning. So in dialogue with our local context, education is not neutral. Science is not mere facts, and humanities are not mere art. Humanizing education in this way equips and liberates children to read the Word and read the world, and to see meaningful ways to use their gifts to live out their vocation, to transform society to a just, sustainable peace. So I circle back to Freire's reminder that education does not transform the world. Education transforms people, and people transform the world. So rooted in our Lutheran heritage and tradition, the Lutheran World Federation has supported education at various levels since its founding by supporting both the capacity of member churches and through diaconal education programs with partners in humanitarian work and country programs of LWF World Service, and acknowledging all of the economic, ecological, and social issues of exclusion that we face in our world, the LWF youth presented a message to the 12th LWF Assembly in Namibia that was grounded on 3 pillars, one of which was education. And I'm grateful for the ways that LEA embodies this call to build on our Lutheran tradition of education that not only informs, but forms and transforms our children so that they can transform the world. So before going to the next section, I want to pause here and get us into groups to reflect on this in your context. The context of transformation is well summed up in LEA's Growing Deep initiative, particularly the elements of foundations and cultures and building on capabilities and contributing to the outcomes of education. So I want you to reflect in your experience of being an educator, in your particular discipline or class or in your context for teaching or ministry. How do you understand your role as an educator in the formation of learners? And secondly, what are the meaningful relationships that shape your learners' formation in the course and the context where you teach? In the first part, I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goal 4 on quality education for social cohesion and transformation. And I want to come back to that now and move from the educational philosophy to pedagogical questions related to equipping students for reformation and transformation. I want to start by sharing this story of the Lutheran Church in Liberia, who, through the Liberia Council of Churches, has been leading an initiative called Waking the Giant, which is the LWF program of engaging member churches in work related to the Sustainable Development Goals, and in this case, SDG 4 on education for post-conflict transformation. One school hosts 486 students growing up in the wake of civil war, most of whom were internally displaced persons along with their families. And overcoming the trauma of violence is one of the goals of their curriculum. The principal, Dr. Minjay, said, "We have students here whose parents fought against each other during the civil wars. And whether the students are aware or not, they're now living in the same dorms, they attend the same classes, they play football together. This helps break down the perceptions of tribalism and nepotism, and is one of our success stories as an institution." Seeing our students graduate and take part in Liberia's private as well as public spheres is deeply rewarding. But, he affirms, I believe there's also a secret to post-war reconciliation in our teaching methodology here. A UNESCO global report urges educational institutions to consider those teaching methodologies, didactic methods, And the report suggested one of the most tenacious challenges to improving quality education is not only access to education, but effectiveness at facilitating learning as education for social transformation. This is actually indicator point 7 for SDG 4. Education 2030 and other associated documents suggest that educators need to address the metacognitive frameworks and skills. In other words, we must not only focus on what we're teaching, but how we're teaching. If we want to effectively teach to transform, we need to use transformative methods that liberate learners to engage in transformative and critical theological reflection. In LEA's document, A Framework for Lutheran Schools, the section on lifelong learners, lifelong qualities for learners, says this: effective pedagogy can be used by teachers and others to reflect on the effectiveness of their teaching by considering whether their pedagogies, assessment practices, reporting practices, learning experiences, classroom climate contribute to the nurturing of lifelong qualities for learners. When using or developing a school's pedagogical framework, such as the productive pedagogy material, it's helpful to reflect on the attributes and qualities and how they can be nurtured by judicious selection of pedagogy. End quote. So for those judicious selection of pedagogy, I know that LEA aligns with the Melbourne Declaration on Educational Goals for Young Australians. And many of these are reflected and relate to SDG 4, specifically the Incheon Declaration and 2030 Framework for Action, which make many of the same connections between curricular goals and processes and social transformation, both in terms of post-conflict settings, but also for building social cohesion. So Education 2030 affirms the importance of this metacognitive reflection on strengthening pedagogy for encouraging social transformation in the classroom. And to that end, transformative pedagogy offers us a framework for ensuring that education is humanized. And in these 4 points, I'll share some examples from across our Lutheran family. The first point is being learner-centered, being focused on the cultural context and the needs of the child or learner, including trauma-sensitive methods of teaching. I want to tell you about a school in Rakhine, the troubled state in Myanmar, and there are up to 140,000 internally displaced people. As people declared to be non-citizens by the government, Rohingya do not have access to education. And so there the LWF's Education for Change program serves 32,000 children, irrespective of creed or citizenship, through a partnership that includes Australian Lutheran World Service, to send over 400 teachers into more than 100 schools to provide vocational training and primary education. And there are particular needs for students with disabilities to access learning. And so the LWF education and officer in Rakhine, Puzine Teknang, says the school includes physical improvements to structures, the provision of assistive devices, and training for teachers on how to identify and support children with disabilities who are already in their classrooms. And Jessica Gregson, the LWF coordinator in Rakhine, says the schools aim to ensure that children affected by conflict in central Rakhine state receive quality, inclusive, safe, and protective education that is supported by communities. This is education for change. The second point is to use pedagogies that help create critical consciousness. That is, methods of learning that are in dialogue with the meaningful generative concepts that are meaningful in each of our cultures. So I want to tell you about LWF in Cameroon, who provides primary education aimed at social cohesion for over 29,000 children. The town of Bourgop, near the border with Central African Republic, is a town of 1,000 people that saw an influx of over 12,000 refugees from the fighting in CAR. And the Officer for Basic Education, Yahya Ibrahim, said, Our challenge is the issue of social cohesion. When the refugees came, it was not easy at first, and the infrastructure was not sufficient, even for the host community itself. Living together was not easy." End quote. But the two LWF schools established quickly listening clubs, which are central to Freire's culture circles, where students can share their stories and share their meaningful ideas. They can pose problems and they can seek to understand messages of social cohesion and peace. So that leads us to the third point, which is methods that encourage a problem-posing education. In other words, beginning with or incorporating the problems or the situations that we face in real life so we can find solutions of social cohesion together. And I want to tell you about refugee camps of Ali Ade and Hol Hol in Djibouti, also in partnership with the Australian Lutheran World Service. The LWF there implements primary education for over 4,000 children. And there, Fatuma was studying in secondary school, and she noticed the problems of sanitation and hygiene, and especially education and awareness for girls. And so, based on those problems that were meaningful to that community, her studies were turned to being a hygiene promoter. And she says, God willing, she would like to be a doctor. Her problem-posing education, she said, is light and the backbone of life. So the last point I want to make is about creative assessment. Just like teaching methods, methods of evaluation need to be humanized to reflect the students' learning goals and draw on their own gifts for demonstrating their knowledge in meaningful ways. UNESCO documents of Education 2030 outline the need to diversify methods of assessment, balancing the summative assessments of learning with creative assessments for learning, which result in new knowledge or creative meaning. So in the same way that teaching methods respond to the student's ability to create meaning, creative assessment can promote the student's meaningful impact on a relevant situation by a creative contribution while measuring their mastery of the knowledge. So to illustrate this, I want to return us to Cameroon in the Borgop School, where Dogari Samson is an artist who recognizes the discrimination between children of different religious and ethnic groups. He says, we must do a lot to help them avoid these conflicts, and for this, the listening club is like the locomotive of a train. It's there to take the lead for messages of peace in the school and in the community. End quote. So as a final assessment of this part of the curriculum, Samson asked the children to create art that embody what they've learned. And 14-year-old Mariamu drew an image of two children playing football together and told her class, even if we're from different blocks, we should play together. We must do like them. So the Borgop School, like the others, humanize education and coordinate pedagogy to the assessment to ensure in this education that there's a formation for transformation. So I want to thank you, LEA, for continuing to build the capacity of your educators to think about teaching and to think about how we humanize education as a way to embody this Lutheran rationale about education for transformation. That information and formation lead to personal, ecclesial, and social transformation in the relationships that you establish in your classrooms and in your communities. And I want to end by affirming that approaching education in this framework of transformative pedagogy is something that Christians can resonate with, because Christianity is a faith based on an encounter. Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus was the liberating word that came incarnate in real political and social reality of oppressive systems. And Jesus encountered them, taught and transformed. He didn't just simply give a new law. He loved and showed the way. That encounter with the Word in the world helped those with eyes to see see the powers of injustice and oppression, and liberated them to see the path to transform those systems. In other words, I can teach you about love, or I can love you, and you know the difference. And like the gospel, transformative pedagogy is about embedding learning and formation in these relationships with critical, creative, concrete, and contextual relationships that liberate learners to reform and transform. So at this point, I want to thank you and send us into small groups again to reflect on a last question and wonder together, now going back to your framework for Lutheran schools, to ask and share with one another what are some of the pedagogical choices that you make in order to relate the curriculum to those aims of education, to equip young people to live out their vocation for social and ecological cohesion and sustainable peace.